Hi, good morning. Hi, good morning. Well, good afternoon to everyone there in Southeast Asia. So I think let me just I think Dr. Simangan is here, Dr. Spandler, Dr. Untalan, Mina, are you there? Okay, so hi, good afternoon, everyone. So welcome to the roundtable panel to launch the book that I recently published. So we have several panelists here who I'm very grateful to them for agreeing to read the book. I sent the book to them a few months ago, so the advanced copy of the book. We'll just wait for Dr. Untalan for her to join us. So Dr. Untalan will be the moderator as well as the panelists.
Okay, I think I'm ready. I just had to unmute myself. So welcome to this PISO Roundtable and the first book launching of my friend and colleague Salvador Santino Regilme Jr.'s new book, Aid Imperium, United States Foreign Policy and Human Rights in Post-Cold War Southeast Asia by the prestigious University of Michigan Press. My name is Carmina Untalan. I'm a specially appointed assistant professor from Osaka University and I will moderate this panel. So today we have a very interesting combination of panelists from different disciplinary backgrounds and professions who will share their insights and reflections about Aid Imperium. So each panelist will have 10 minutes and the rest of the time will be allotted for Q&A and discussion. For the panelists, I will signal you on the 8th minute and we want to keep the time quite strictly so that we have enough time for discussion. And for the audience, please feel free to type your comments and questions during the discussion and I will diligently collect them for the Q&A. Before giving the floor to Santi and the panelists, I would like to briefly introduce the author. I'm sure if you Google Santino's name and you'll find an endless list of his accomplishments. I'll give a very brief one here. So Santino Regilme is a tenured university lecturer in international relations and human rights at the Institute for History, Leiden University in the Netherlands. Aside from his new book, Aid Imperium, he is also a co-editor of a forthcoming volume, Human Rights at Risk, International Institutions, American Power and Future of Dignity by Rutgers University Press, and co-editor of this book that I really like, American Hegemony and the Rise of Emerging Powers by Routledge. He holds a joint PhD in Political Science and North American Studies from the Free University of Berlin, and has previously studied at Yale, Osnabrück, and Göttingen. He is the 2019 inaugural winner of the International Studies Association's Asia Pacific Best Conference Paper Award. I'll also introduce our panelists. First, we have Professor Dahlia Simangan, who we met earlier during her insightful keynote speech. She's an associate professor at Hiroshima University's Graduate School of Humanities and Social Science. Next, we have Professor Rizalino Malabed, who is also my former professor. He's an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. And then we have CJ Chanco, who is a graduate student of geography at York University. His research interest covers human rights of refugees and migrants. Unfortunately, he cannot be with us right now, but he kindly prepared a video. Next, we have Raymond Marvick or Ice Baguilat. He's a litigation lawyer and human rights scholar from the University of the Philippines College of Law, where he serves as both senior lecturer and senior research associate. And then we have Kilian Spandler, Dr. Kilian Spandler, who is a researcher in the School of Global Studies, University of Gothenburg. His expertise covers regional governance in Africa, Europe, and Southeast Asia. And he's also the author of the book Regional Organization and International Society. So as we see, we have a very diverse set of panelists. And without further ado, I'll give the floor to Santino to present his book.
Thank you so much, Mina. So thanks everyone, especially the panelists and for being here. So I just wanted to speak for the next 5 minutes. So I think we'll have a bit more time for for the contributions of each panelist, but also for Q&A later on. So I will not get into the details of the book, but I would like to just highlight the key motivation of the book as well as the key arguments. So I started the book almost 15 years ago, at least the initial thought about the project itself. In fact, I started it during a seminar paper under Professor Malabed's course in Theories of International Relations. It has something to do about U.S. counterterrorism or counterterrorism in the context of U.S.-led global war on terror. So that was the time before I moved to Europe for graduate studies. And of course, at that time also, I was, as a third generation member of our family who worked for the Philippine government as a military intelligence analyst. This was also the motivation for me to write something about the implications or perhaps the detrimental impacts of human right of U.S. military assistance on state repression and physical integrity rights in Southeast Asia. So let me start first with the global context of my project. So the United States is by far the largest single foreign donor government with more than 200 recipient countries. So historically speaking, so if you look into the USAID Green Book, you will find out that the United States has recorded at least as early as 1947 or 1948 all the amounts of foreign assistance that it has given to all countries that has existed before, and that's probably gone now. That's why it's around 200 recipient countries. So it's all transparent. And in fact, you can even look into the details. Is it for agricultural assistance? Is it for intelligence funds? Now, the main legitimating discourse for U.S. foreign aid is really about, at least in the last two to three decades, and even in the context of the global war on terror, was really about human rights and democracy promotion. I'm not claiming that it was really for human rights and democracy promotion, but let's just say to the point that that was the dominant dominant master narrative of post-Cold War U.S. foreign policy. Yet this kind of legitimating discourse has been under assault in recent years. Illiberal politicians have been gaining traction in many parts of the world, not only in the global south, like in the case of the Philippines, in the case of Turkey, but also here in the global north, in the case of Hungary, or even here where I am right now, where I'm based here in the Netherlands. Now, in most theoretical debates in the social sciences, perhaps in development sociology, in development economics, and to some extent more recently in international relations, foreign aid is usually characterized either as good or bad for global south countries. So it seems to be quite divided in these two camps, particularly in terms of various types of political consequences. It can be for economic development, for good governance, or even human rights. And of course, you can disaggregate what kind of human rights you might be referring to. In this book, in Aid Imperium, I aim to dispel this often simplistic and blatantly ideological characterizations of foreign aid and its transformative consequences in recipient countries. So I hope that I was able to challenge this conventional wisdom, which often implies that material resources have inherent properties, thereby making it either good or bad for recipient countries. My theory, so the theory that I offer in the book is called interest convergence theory of foreign aid and human rights. And I aim to underscore in this theory how donor and recipient governments' shared expectations and strategic purposes shape the patterns of use of foreign strategic support. It sounds very constructivist, but in fact, the theory that I develop in the book is really much more of an analytically eclectic theory. I think this is perhaps indirectly, if you look into the sociology of how the theory was produced, right? This book developed from a PhD dissertation in which you have 3 dissertation members who come from different traditions. So my chair was a student of Wendt at Chicago who is a blatant constructivist. The second is an IR scholar based at the time at Yale who is doing natural experiments, so field experiments. And then the third one is one of Europe's most popular, I would say, constructivists. So in a way, perhaps if you look into the sociology of how the theory developed, I thought that it's much more important to develop a much more concrete research puzzle. And therefore, I developed a theory. So the question that I'd like to, the puzzle that I raise in this book constitutes two basic questions. So first, does United States foreign aid undermine physical integrity rights? And if so, how and under which conditions does it undermine or promote human rights? So I only refer to physical integrity rights. So when I say physical integrity rights, the freedom of the human person from any form of abuse, physical or mental abuse from state agents. So I'm referring here to state violence per se. In this book, I argue that foreign aid is actually important to the extent that it actually interacts with domestic political factors. If the converging interests of donor and recipient governments are focused on a wide range of purposes, so for example, socioeconomic development purposes, but also militaristic purposes, as it was in the case in the early post-Cold War years in the 1990s, plus you have a strong domestic legitimacy in the recipient country. Therefore, it is more likely that you have fewer collateral human rights abuses, but also the absence of abuses that were deemed to be part and parcel of what I call as selective political repression. So selective political repression is a mechanism in which the recipient government targets not only armed rebel groups, but also unarmed rebel groups. You've seen this in the case, for example, of local political opposition members in Thailand during the time of Thaksin, for example, or, for example, student activists or opposition journalists, for example, in the case of the Philippines in the 2000s, for example. Now, I will not get into the details of the argument, but my motivation, there were only three motivations, so I'll just close in the next 2 minutes. The first motivation here, or what I intend to contribute in the literature, is that first, this book is part of this emerging research agenda in the social sciences that investigates the links between domestic and extranational factors in producing local political change. I adopt a analytic eclectic approach here, so from the tradition of Peter Katzenstein, in making sure that I develop a theoretical framework for foreign aid and human rights that's not only applicable to Southeast Asian cases that I looked into, but I hope to develop it in other cases. In fact, I did something like this also for Colombia, by looking first into the interaction between ideational factors, so the role of ideas, discourses, and normative beliefs, but also how they interact with strategic instrumental motivations, right? Of both extranational, so transnational, and domestic actors. So really bringing in these kinds of factors that are often coming from disparate literature. Some literatures will focus on ideas, some literatures will focus on strategic interests, and some literatures will focus only on domestic factors. And I think this is very common if you talk with Philippine studies scholars, or some scholars will only talk about extranational factors. So it's really bringing this together in this integrative theory. So I think, secondly, I highlight the political agency of global South actors in this book. If you hear, perhaps discussions about foreign aid, both from the left or the right, or somewhere in the center and the undecided, they would say like, foreign aid is really bad for recipient countries. So I argue here that really foreign aid is just determined by the interest in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., or in the case of the EU in Brussels. I dispute this claim. I argue that the political agency of global South actors are important in negotiating and chart their political trajectories with powerful actors in the global North. In fact, my fieldwork in Washington, D.C. confirms this, right? Rather than only from intuition. the United States is not out there giving out foreign aid. You need to hire lobbyists. For example, if I come from a particular country in the global south, I need to hire lobbyists in Washington, D.C. in order to make the claim that I deserve foreign aid. So I hope to make this claim, and I hope to make this argument clear in the book by highlighting this interaction between global south and global north actors as they, particularly the elites in those donor and recipient countries, as they craft this foreign aid program that they have. And finally, I hope to develop a causal theory that maps out these mechanisms that link foreign aid and physical integrity rights. Especially if you read economics literature about foreign aid, you look into these very methodologically sophisticated correlations between foreign aid and human rights, but it's not really clear what the causal mechanisms are and how these two variables link with each other. And I hope that the book perhaps it served my purpose of understanding for myself, at least. If the panelists do, perhaps will very much disagree with me, but I felt like this was really something that for me, it served its purpose, that it clarified to me what was really the relationship between these international factors with domestic factors. So again, I look forward to your feedback, and thank you so much. It's I know that we are here on a Saturday, and I just look forward to this discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Santi, for that wonderful synopsis of your book. I actually enjoyed reading it. Now we turn on to the panelists. I'll start first with Professor Dahlia Simangan for her comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Carmina, and thank you, Santino. First of all, massive congratulations on this achievement in the midst of the pandemic, right? All the while editing a book and publishing articles. And thank you for this opportunity to engage with your work, which is even more important now, given the issues on geopolitical dynamics that influence international peace and security and domestic politics. And also, thanks to this publication, I learned that as you said, the converging interests of foreign aid donors and recipients can substantially shape domestic politics. And I learned that, and I quote you from your book, that aid recipients with weak domestic political legitimacy are more likely to instrumentalize foreign aid. This is so enlightening to me, because I learned that recipients are not just this passive. They're not passive recipients, but they are also actively using or channeling that aid to enhance their legitimacy and serve their interests ultimately. And what's striking to me is that at the end of the day, we have a say in influencing foreign policy. Again, we are not passive recipients. Individuals like me can influence policies one way or another. And just the thought of that is so empowering. Also, in that same train of thought, it's not just the perpetrators who have the power to change political and social landscapes, but activists, human rights activists, individual citizens as well. We can also make a dent to this dynamics because after all, right, we also choose who leads us. And our histories have proven this, also in the Philippines. And with that backdrop, the book reminds me that yes, foreign aid needs to be more sensitive of its ripple effects on human rights promotion, but such sensitivity should also include not just the considerations or priorities of governments, but also the needs and the perspectives of non-state actors, because non-state actors are also recipients, and even they are the ultimate recipients, I would say, of this foreign aid. And after all, as Santino wrote in the book, states are not monolithic, and individual citizens or groups are components of this statehood. And I can also relate to Santino's framework and extensive discussion on the relationship between foreign aid and human rights with that of international assistance for post-conflict or conflict-affected societies. So it's just my primary area of interest. Because in peace-building literature, the analysis either overstates the impact of foreign aid on domestic politics of peace-building processes, That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, there's also this overemphasis on the consequences of the decisions or actions of domestic political actors. But in my own research on peace building, Santino's framework, I think, will be valuable for me to graduate from that binary analysis and instead look at the convergence of the interests between foreign donors and domestic actors and highlight the impact of that convergence, or maybe the lack thereof, right, in the context of implementing peace building processes. In other words, this shared ideas or shared interests as the mediating factor are equally influential, if not more influential, when we explain the dynamics between international and domestic actors and contexts. With that, somehow it makes me think too, if there's a difference between foreign aid to peace building during the Cold War and after 9/11, like what Santino did in the book, when US greatly directed these processes, and recently now with China's growing presence. For example, I heard that China somehow influences peacekeeping by not giving priority financially when it comes to funding the human rights and gender aspects of peacekeeping operations. So this is more of my reflection. But again, thanks to Santino's framework in the book, I think it's also interesting whether such a short change when it comes to funding somehow converges with some of the interests of domestic political actors in post-conflict or conflict-affected societies. I remember when I was conducting my interviews in Cambodia and Timor-Leste, there were complaints of how foreign assistance was channeling so much money to sending human rights experts to the recipient countries instead of using those funding to build the very capacity for ensuring that human rights are protected and promoted even after the exit of the internationals. So this technocratic tendencies in peace building, I realized, could be caused by this lack of shared interests between donor countries and recipient countries. And this framework that in the book unpacks for us in detail is really useful, not just in the relationship between foreign aid and human rights, but also in other international and national and external and internal dynamics. And there's another aspect of the book that really resonates well with me, which is the contention with regard to analytic emphasis on quantitative aid data. And Santino was really successful in convincing us that our analysis must go beyond quantification. Although this quantitative data, of course, they do provide us with a broad overview of where aid goes, who gives aid, an analysis of this shared public discourses can enrich our understanding of such dynamics. And this could be done with a qualitative analysis of policy preferences of both donors and recipients. And Aid Imperium was successful in highlighting the importance of complementing quantitative data and analysis with that of qualitative data and analysis. Santino also did this, I believe, with such sophistication that he employed a multi-level analysis from macro to meso to micro levels of analysis. And in doing so, illustrated to us that such multi-level analysis can benefit from different methodologies. What I also especially love about the book are the policy recommendations that Santino presented, particularly in the concluding chapter. And I really like the way how specific these recommendations are, because personally, I find it really challenging, at least in my own research, to translate the conceptual critiques that I write about into concrete and palatable policy recommendations. But for someone not in the policy side like me, the lesson that Santino highlighted about scoping the domestic state repression in the global south really resonates with me. And again, this is applicable for many other issues, either domestic or international. And the book also covered the state of impunity in the Philippines. And I completely agree that foreign aid should recognize and really work around the possibility that such aid can support or even reinforce such culture of impunity, right? And given this possibility, and this is where my question starts, Santino, I'm curious if there has been evidence that shows that the outcomes of this foreign aid can last long beyond the government that received the aid or beyond the political life of the domestic actors involved in that government. I'm asking this because I'm really curious whether public support or public condemnation of punitive policies, such as in the Philippines, can have long-term impact. And if they do, and to put it simply, do foreign aid received during the time of a specific administration can influence future administrations and the overall governance system of the recipient country? And that's my question, my only question. And finally, to the audience, please buy the book or ask your supervisors or your libraries to buy the book. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Dahlia.
Okay, are we good? Okay, thank you very much, Professor Simangan. Before Santi will comment towards the end, I suppose. Okay, so let me call on the next panelist, my former professor, actually, Professor Rizalino Malabed, for his comments.
First, let me share my screen. I'll just play it. Ayun. Nako. Technical difficulty. Ayun. Play. All right. Magandang hapon sa ating lahat. Masaya ako na nandito kasama ang mga dati kong estudyante na ngayon yung mga successful colleagues, si Santi at saka si Mina. Pero at the same time, I conflicted din ako. On the one hand, I feel proud of what they have achieved. And on the other hand, I feel insecure that they have bettered me. And so I will bury and repress this this traumatic ambivalence and go on and read a text that I have prepared in order to limit myself to the mandatory 10 minutes. It has been a while since I did any IR research. This is because I have gone back to reading and writing philosophy. Thus, perhaps unfairly and without regard for any benefit to the IR discipline, I read Santi's book as a philosopher. Luckily, I believe in the notion that philosophy is conditioned by truth procedures such as politics, and the worst that I did is to think the Imperium. Before I proceed, though, I must mention that I am doing some parallel thinking of the colonization and post-coloniality prompted by a book that coincidentally is coming out at the same time in North America, The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and Wengrove. Previously, my thinking was guided by Dipesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe. But now, it appears that to relegate Western ideas is also to set aside our legacy. The assertion is that so-called Western ideas and practices born out of the Enlightenment were the outcome of encounters and deliberations between Europeans and the soon-to-be colonized world. So, for example, the Western notion of natural law conceptualized to the production of the noble savage is the result of Europe's encounter with the rest of the world. And this is actually surprising. Liberty and equality, solidarity, the ideals of the French Revolution of the end of the Enlightenment are born of the dialogue with indigenous Americans in the North American colonies. Meanwhile, the threshold that allowed entry for my thinking the aid Imperium is its substitution of foreign strategic assistance for foreign aid. Immediately, the word strategic emphasized the structuring political interests and relations that underpin the assistance, that is, of empire and domination, but also the novel assertion of its components, ideational and material, made me recall a truism bandied around during my IR days: liberal talk, realist action. And all of a sudden, through philosophic lens, The problem of Imperium and aid has become a matter of ideology. Beyond the simple dynamics of the simulation, the truism indicates a structuring and a production, that of the reality of empire in global relations. However, we must take note here of a feature in strategic assistance for the Philippines and Thailand. During the period 1992 to 2010, economic assistance comprised around 70 to 80% of the total aid to the Philippines. This is more or less true for Thailand in the same period. We can surmise that the ideational component for strategic assistance in both countries during this period is dominated by economic rationalizations, and thus interest convergence is more economic than military. This is what we usually expect and observe. We must note here also that this is not true for Thailand in the previous decade of democratization, when military assistance trumped economic assistance 2-to-1 at its peak. Let us deploy here a simple model of the structuring of reality from Jacques Lacan and Slavoj Žižek. It is basically how we are conscious of and come to know what exists. The real is how things are in themselves. The symbolic is representation in general, language, norms, culture, laws, structures of administration. The imaginary is the serial deployment of the symbolic as fantasy, meaning-making, signifiers, or specter. Here, reality is structured by the dialectics of the symbolic and the imaginary. The symbolic represents the real, the things as they are, into an all, but fails. The imaginary as master signifier or as a specter fills in or stands in for the gap of the symbolic's failure and completes the representation. We can then apply the model to the foreign strategic assistance problematique. First, we have liberal humanism or humanitarianism, but also liberal economic development and governance as the overarching rationalization for the politics of foreign strategic assistance. But this usually fails to explain long-standing economic inequality and power asymmetry between the North and the South. It leaves a gap fillable by conflict and misunderstanding. Instead, this gap must be filled in by meaning-making that fosters cooperation among the unequal and that preserves the situation. Thus, second, we have ideational meaning-making expressed as interest convergence. This will normally be enough of a stopgap for bilateral or multilateral cooperation. But if it disappoints, it pays to have a common enemy that is blameworthy for the original and the secondary failure. A common enemy cements an unequal relationship into a bull-headed partnership. And so, liberal humanism presents the multiplicity of politics into an all, but fails. Ideational convergence, or failing that, the specter of a common enemy, fills in or stands in for the gap of liberalism's failure. How does this manifest in a case? Following the 8 Imperiums example, we will consider foreign strategic assistance during the Duterte regime from 2016 to 2020 as a case. The data for 2020 and 2021 are still incomplete, although figures up to 354.618 million and 109.298 million US dollars respectively are already available. In 2020, 41% is military aid and 59% is economic. In 2021, all aid so far is economic. The 2020 military share actually reflects a trend that is true since 2016, the year Duterte came into power. Meanwhile, 2021 marks the end of Trump's leadership. I am aware that the book stops short of considering the Duterte period because it deems it not comparable to the other cases. I'm going ahead in part due to curiosity and in part due to the gut feeling and bad taste in the mouth that it does fit nicely into the book's theory. If you look at the graphs, they show increasing strategic assistance up to 2019 from a drop in 2017. But this observation is dwarfed by the fact that strategic support for the Duterte administration compares favorably vis-a-vis that of the Arroyo regime. First, this contradicts our expectation of no support to minimal support, especially after Duterte's tirade against American imperialism and against American atrocities during the Filipino-American War. Second, it goes against the commonplace assumption that the Duterte administration favors China over the US, and that this is reflected by waning US support. These expectations are especially convincing apropos Duterte's threats to unilaterally abrogate the Visiting Forces Agreement and the Trump administration's withdrawal from its global obligations. But beyond the strategic support amounts, is the shocking share of military aid: 53% in 2016, 45% in 2017, 40% in 2018, and 53% in 2019, all at the height of Duterte's drug war and war against dissent. Did the US, through its foreign strategic support, abet the extrajudicial killings of thousands for which Duterte is being investigated by the International Criminal Court? Plugged into the book's model, we have a general convergence between Trumpism and Dutertismo, articulated as shared nationalist and militarist interests. This is materially practiced on the ground as resources mobilized into military and police spending, buttressed by Duterte's strong domestic legitimacy. Impunity, weak courts, indiscriminate terror jingoism, corruption, and the incompetence in the military and the police all lead to killings that cannot be measured by our outrage. And thus, we can model the case as the production and reproduction of the reality of Imperium in the dark years of Duterte and Trump. Far-right populism represents the multiplicity of politics into an all but fails. Convergence on the ideals of nationalism and militarism and the specter of radical politics as common enemy fills in or stands in for the gap of liberalism's original failure. Thank you.
Thanks, Jong. Salamat.
Sharing. Ayun. All right.
Okay, thank you very much, Sir Jong. The third speaker will be CJ, and as I said, you won't be here, so maybe I can just play the video that. Okay, so they're already playing the video. Okay.
Hi everyone, I'm so sorry I can't be joining you today. I am a little too far away. I'd first off just like to thank Salvador for the opportunity to review his book. So I'll just be sharing some of my brief thoughts on the book, Aid Imperium, US Foreign Policy and Human Rights in Post-Cold War Southeast Asia. So the impacts of foreign aid on human rights promotion has at best a mixed record. While it has been the subject of much debate and critique, I believe Salvador takes a unique approach for understanding exactly how foreign assistance, in this case American aid, affects human rights outcomes in the global South. Salvador starts off by demonstrating the clear correlations between increases in US foreign assistance and the rise in human rights violations in recipient countries. But his critique of US aid is also a nuanced one. Central to Salvador's account is the role played by policy elites in recipient countries and their relationship with elites in the donor country. What affects human rights outcomes, in other words, is the convergence or divergence of their respective interests. To illustrate his argument, he takes Thailand and the Philippines as case studies of the actual impacts of US foreign strategic assistance. By foreign strategic assistance, the term encompasses both material, that is military or financial aid, and the discursive elements attached to human rights promotion and legitimacy building in the recipient country. Two major historical moments come up for analysis. First, the 1990s, in retrospect, a decade of fleeting post-Cold War optimism in the possibility of aid's role in promoting human rights. And the second period, the post-9/11 war on terror. The book draws on quantitative methods, even as it is theoretically informed by authors like Amitav Acharya, who emphasizes the agency of actors in the global South. In that sense, Salvador's work promises to be a major contribution to the literature that emphasizes the role of smaller countries in pulling the puppet strings and even influencing superpowers. Indeed, what I find most interesting is his account of the instrumentalization of aid by local elites to bolster their own domestic legitimacy. In both Thailand and the Philippines, for example, those elites would mobilize the American obsession with the war on terror to negotiate for increases in aid that would coincide with rampant human rights violations against political dissidents and civil society. This was, of course, often contrary to the stated intentions of American foreign policy, whose own reputation has been damaged in practice. But even during moments when interests appear to converge around the importance of human rights and democratization, for example, between the Aquino and Obama administrations, weak judicial institutions and a culture of impunity would hinder reform efforts in the Philippines. In fact, Southeast Asia is a clear example, if ever we needed one, that goes against liberal assumptions that aid, economic development, and human rights, or respect for human rights, necessarily go hand in hand. In some, Salvador criticizes, on one hand, the Western-centric bias that argues that aid is an inherent good only made bad by local cultures or corrupt politicians, and on the other, leftist critiques of aid as an absolute evil. In other words, the problem is not aid per se, but how this aid is manipulated for various political ends in both the donor and recipient countries. Aid Imperium will no doubt have broader applications for other global south contexts in Latin America, Africa, or the Middle East. I was, however, left wondering what alternatives Salvador might have in mind for countries in the crosshairs of an emerging Cold War, where aid will be, as it always has been, an instrument of foreign influence, as we saw in the vaccine wars throughout the pandemic. In a world where economic and military might ultimately and unfortunately still structure the premises of the international order, the vacuum left behind by the United States and the West in general will be filled by other superpowers, this time with no longer even the pretense of defending human rights or universal values. What will their aid imperiums then look like? I'm not optimistic. Thank you.
Okay, I hope CJ's video was clear for us to think about our questions for the Q&A. I'll call the next panelist, attorney Raymond Baguilat. You can have the floor. Thanks.
Thank you. So first, allow me to thank the author, Salvador Santino Regilme, for this opportunity to share my perspective on his proposition that was eloquently explained in the book. I hope that it would allow the readers to critically examine the myth and rhetoric surrounding Western-led interventions in the Global South. With that, allow me to extend this further from the perspective of a member of an indigenous community, an advocate for the marginalized sector, and a member of the academia. Currently, the Philippines has been the hotbed of human rights violations, touted as the deadliest country for land and environmental defenders. In the midst of the pandemic, 29 killings of land and environmental defenders in the country have been recorded last year. And some of the people who have died were actually my friends defending their ancestral domain. Extrajudicial executions have also been a problem with the rise of cardboard justice and the prevalence of stories of nanlaban or police justifying self-defenses as a reason for murder. This led to the Human Rights Council to adopt resolutions calling for the Philippine government to ramp up actual and effective investigations. But TJKs persist despite COVID-19 lockdowns. Again, as of September 2020, the Duterte administration officially admitted that there had been no less than 5,903 drug-related deaths resulting from anti-drug operations. Distressingly, the death figure could even be higher, for according to the UN Human Rights Council, the death rate could be from 8,663 to up to 3 times more if the country's figures from several rights groups are considered. As mentioned, EJKs persist despite the COVID-19 pandemic, leading the International Criminal Court to formally investigate President Duterte and others as to their alleged crimes against humanity. The Philippines post-Cold War was depicted to be in turmoil as it attempted to recover after the Philippine People Power Revolution in 1986. By the time the Cold War ended, West Point-educated Fidel V. Ramos became the president, and along came the efforts to mainstream human rights. However, by tying human rights with economic aid, human rights development became inorganic. It became transactional, and with it followed the ebb and flow of the donors' policy, which was also reflected in the book. The most problematic policies in the country, the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos and his declaration of martial law, as well as the war on drugs, may be traced actually from American policies. The former owing to the anti-communist policy of the US, and the latter following the Nixon war on drugs, that was sustained and amplified by Reagan and H.W. Bush, Clinton, and the second W. Bush. By allowing aid to be tied to other overarching policies to the detriment of human rights, it seems to be sending a signal that human rights may take a backseat in relation to the supposed higher values like security. By tying aid to other interests, finance appears to be the single most important consideration. As such, domestic policies, corruption, and rent-seeking behavior in the country should indeed be further analyzed. Because caught in the middle are people on the margins, who post-1986 were still reeling from the effects of militarization and the absence of an effective rule of law. Echoing the late Professor Richard Claude, the Philippines after the Cold War was also in turmoil, but towards a turmoil of life and not death, was therefore moving towards a more human and humane way of developing society and political community. Unfortunately, making human rights contingent on economic aid made these developments inorganic, and the country's pivot to China is emblematic of this shift. China, who recently promised progress through the reconstruction of conflict-torn Marawi in Mindanao and the development of dams such as in Kaliwa in the Sierra Madres, show this. All this failed to properly gather the consent of the peoples affected. China also threatens to be an important player in the Philippine national elections, with leading presidential candidate Bongbong Marcos, son of dictator President Ferdinand Marcos, recently meeting with a Chinese envoy to the Philippines. Lamentably, those who call foul are claimed to be insurgents. For example, IP groups who cry against development aggressions have been tagged as members of the New People's Army, the Philippine Communist Rebel Group. With this, can we therefore rely on aid to start democratizing and developing human rights? Again, I would like to echo Professor Claude. International aid is admittedly essential in assisting human rights protection in the country. However, this should not be tied to anything other than to establish a just and humane society. That should be the end goal in itself. If not, it would only discount human rights as the highest value that should be achieved. Further, there should be recognition that efforts should be multi-directional with attention to bottom-up processes that advance grassroots participation. You cannot just focus on the military or police brass or members of the government when it comes to human rights development. Aid should primarily be directed to local communities. And towards this end, non-government organizations should be treated as good facilitators who will begin these grassroots efforts. Lastly, if minded to truly determine the effectiveness of human rights aid programs, it is submitted that states such as the United States should provide their aid programs to look at the existence of strong, independent, and critical NGOs, as well as educational institutions as a benchmark of a successful aid program that is tied to human rights protection. When NGOs and academic freedom are trampled upon in the guise of the war on drugs and anti-terrorism efforts, this highlights the slow deterioration of democracy in the country. This is considering the focus on mere government investigations as a measure of protection of human rights. Again, the submissions hope to add to the propositions of Dr. Regilme, which I believe would be critical, especially in a post-COVID-19 new normal. With that, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to hearing the questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ice.
Okay, thank you very much, Ice, for that. Now for our fourth panelist, we have Dr. Kilian Spandler from Gothenburg University. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks to Santino for the invitation. It's great to be with you here. and celebrate the publication of your book. And I think that you have delivered an important book, a book that challenges us to rethink the role of foreign aid for human rights, and by doing so situates everyday questions of the human existence in political dynamics of truly global scope. A book that provides really intriguing histories of US hegemony in Southeast Asia, but does so from a refreshingly trans-local point of view. And also a book that is really thoroughly researched, and the preface gives a taste of the scope of the endeavor, that the journey that you went on, as well as being theoretically extremely rich. At the same time, it's clear that for you this was not a purely intellectual exercise, and I think those factors taken together really make for a compelling read. And I think the book's true recipe for success is that it is theoretically ambitious, but at the same time also parsimonious. So in sort of the framework, you promise a grand synthesis to produce a theory that is multi-level, joining the domestic and the transnational level, and it's also integrative, joining material and ideational factors, as well as sort of structural and agential point of views. And that sounds really challenging, but I think you managed to reduce this complexity into a lean theoretical model that proves to have a lot of analytical purchase on the case study. So really well done. And the key move here of bringing together insights from theories of political survival on the one hand and IR on the other is innovative and extremely productive, because it not only reinforces and nuances knowledge about the politics of aid, where it speaks to critical scholarship in that area, but also because it challenges us to radically reconsider the implications of imperialism for the ethics of humanitarianism. And you put it really well in the conclusion when you write, we ought to rethink whether the protection of human dignity and effective aid-giving practices are sustainable within deeply hierarchical and imperium-like structures consisting of powerful states as donors and subordinate governments as recipients. I think sustainable is really a key word here, because as also the other commentators have pointed out, it's not a matter of either or, aid either being beneficial or detrimental, but it really depends. So this is I think a core contribution of your work. Now my comments, they also revolve around a core motive of the book that has been taken up, and I will echo a lot of what others have already said, the core motive of the dialectics of empire and agency. Now, the central objective of the book, as I read it, is to highlight the influence of the recipient governments, and some of the others have also mentioned that, and you yourself in the introduction. So the recipient governments are not mere executors of donor will. That's your key argument, and that connects, of course, to the broader and perennial question of what agency is there for the global South. And you hinted some answers, you provide some very thorough investigation through your case narratives. But at the same time, interestingly, the picture also remains somewhat ambiguous. And I would just, like to dig into that ambiguity in the discussion maybe a little bit. So on the one hand, you have governments who strategically frame their discourses in order to elicit external support, and they truly manage to shrewdly graft onto existing discourses and mobilize aid for their own idiosyncratic goals. But on the other hand, they also, in your case narratives, appear as not passive, but reactive in a sense. So sometimes the convergence almost seems structurally determined by changes in the hegemonic discourses that emerge from the US. For example, when we talk about Thailand's democratization agenda as a response to increased aid conditionality in the 1990s, and Raymond Baguilat only just now also sort of drew parallels in the Philippines during that time. And there sometimes seems to be a quite high degree of, quite direct control by the US, for example, during the war on terror phase, so that the recipient governments almost appear as agents in the sense of principal agent theory, right? So I was just wondering, maybe in the discussion, whether you can shed a bit of light what your thinking is on what exactly is the nature of agency. What parameters can we use? What concepts can we use to think about this? And maybe is it the ambiguity itself that is constitutive of agency in the periphery of the aid imperium? On a side note here, I almost wish to learn about a sort of non-case, right, in which localization attempts fail. So there is no convergence in the end, and we really might be able to see that there is no structural determination that takes departure in the discourses of the global north. So one case that would have been interesting, and maybe we can talk about this, is the early Duterte years, so Duterte versus Obama, where there's clearly no convergence, but you can think of, I think, many other examples. The other point I just wanted to quickly take up is, what is the current state of the aid imperium, right? And I see three main challenges that are interrelated, and some of which have already been hinted at. The first, and that also links back to the question of agency and failed convergence, would you say that the political polarization and volatility in international society that emerges from the rise of nationalist and sovereigntist populism has an impact and impinges on the overall likelihood for convergence, right? So there's more polarization, not just within countries, but also between them. Second, is the crisis of the so-called liberal international order also a crisis of the US-American aid imperium? Especially when you look into Southeast Asia, we have already talked about the elephant in the room. So China, obviously a big challenger, especially recently in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. There might be also a slight shift of allegiances and loyalties and trust, especially into China as an alternative giver of aid. And finally, as a third point here, within Southeast Asia, it's almost impossible to ignore the attempts at building up and shoring up national and regional capacities among states to take matters into their own hand, and you can see that in various sectors. So I'm studying humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, or disaster management, where you have a discourse of localization as well, but it means more like this bringing aid closer to those people who are affected. But also you can think of economic initiatives that effectively exclude the US. So all of these are, of course, baby steps, but they could be read as reducing or attempts at reducing the asymmetric interdependence of Southeast Asian states within the aid imperium. So I just wonder, overall, is today's configuration markedly different from the one you describe in your case studies, or is there more of a continuation within that? Just a final minor point, I'm also interested in the point raised by Dahlia about path dependence across regimes or across governments. That would be interesting to also take up. In general, it would be great and I'm looking forward to discussions, hearing some reflections on these issues and taking it further. But to conclude, congratulations on the significant achievement, and thanks for sharing your research with us.
Thanks, Kilian.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Spandler. I'll be the last panelist, and I'll keep this brief so we can have the questions. So I'd like to begin. I'm delighted to be here today to actually moderate and be a panelist on Santi's book launch. Actually, before the book was published, I was already following Santi's work on democracy, US hegemony, and human rights. And this book, I believe, presents a successful consolidation of his scholastic rigor and dedication to understanding the relationship between American foreign policy, human rights, and domestic politics. Tackling this relationship, I think, is essential, especially in the last decade, where the rise of right-wing populism and human rights abuse across the globe have led many to argue that we are witnessing a decline of liberal and democratic values. Indeed, many of the current analyses tend to depart, as Santi noted in his speech, from either an international or domestic political outlook. On one hand, we have the international discourse based on the decline of American liberal world order and purported rise of China, whose foreign policy have barely intervened with human rights issues and even condoned it, as with the case of Hong Kong and Xinjiang. And on the other hand, we have domestic political discourse that concentrates on national leaders, such as India's Narendra Modi's crackdown on country's press freedom, Philippines' Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs, and then we have Bolsonaro's Brazil, Putin's Russia, Orban's Hungary. The list goes on, really. And amidst this divided discourse between international and domestic, Santi in his book clearly draws the link between the two. Indeed, he demonstrates that the international is inextricably linked with the local when it comes especially to human rights issues. To create this link, Santi concentrated on foreign aid, specifically asked, does foreign aid undermine human rights in recipient countries? And if so, how and under what set of conditions that it impacts human rights outcomes, particularly physical integrity rights, which I really like his elaboration on what physical integrity rights mean. He argues that donor and recipient governments' converging interests, together with the recipient government's level of domestic legitimacy, shapes the foreign aid programs and domestic policies. To support his argument, he carefully interweaves a comprehensive, and by this I really mean comprehensive, theoretical framework with an empirical analysis of these cases. First, the shifting discourse in the Philippines from Ramos to Aquino administrations, and then to Thaksin's war on drugs in Thailand. Aid Imperium shows that politics of foreign aid is much more complicated than the commonplace and even ideological understanding of aid as one hand, as a benevolent and beneficial to recipient countries, and on the other hand, the critical perspective of aid that somehow portrays aid as a Trojan horse that looks enticing, but really is a tool to entrap recipient countries. As my colleagues in this panel have already said, there are several outstanding features in Aid Imperium. Given the short time, I would mention two, which to me resonated very well. First is the book's emphasis on the agency of recipient governments. As Santi points out, the Global South is being portrayed as passive recipient of aid, and any mishandling of these generous gifts from the Americans is largely due to our cultural backwardness and corruption of the recipient country, rather than the negligence, hypocrisy, or even poor management on the donor side. However, rather than participating in this blame game, Aid Imperium chose to examine both sides. First, by choosing the concept Imperium rather than empire, which actually caught my attention, because empire connotes a unidimensional power flow. And second, through his theory of interest convergence. Santi, I think, for me, was able to shed light to the agency of both donor, US, and recipient countries, in this case, Philippines and Thailand, through integrating discourse in his analysis. For instance, the way Ramos' development diplomacy coincided with Clinton's prioritization of development in East Asia illustrates the significance of small state actors' support to the realization even of Washington's foreign policy objectives during that time in East Asia. Likewise, GMA's appropriation of the war on terror to acquire financial assistance from the Bush administration showed how recipient states can manipulate aid to consolidate power to intensify human rights repression and empowerment of the state's coercive apparatus. For me, I'm coming from, this is quite refreshing from the viewpoint of international relations, the field I promiscuously associate myself with, which is now has been criticized for its Eurocentrism. And not only that, but also with the idea that big, usually Western powers dominate the discourse, and small states like the Philippines are rendered secondary, if not negligible. This is useful for my own research because here in my research, I tackle US hegemony and subalterns. But for me, I focus more on non-state actors. And I think the theory, or Santi's multi-level theory, helped me think a lot about my own thing. The second feature, and this is something that may be minor to some, but for me it's big, is the case selection. Although I would honestly prefer to see additional cases in Southeast Asia, such as Cambodia, another Southeast Asian country reliant of foreign aid under Hun Sen, another sort of authoritarian leader. I think the cases presented in Aid Imperium suffices to support the hypothesis of the book. As a student or a young scholar who studies American presence in East Asia, I see the obvious absence of subaltern non-state actors and of actually Asian countries in the discourse. And I cannot help but notice how this region is eclipsed by the critique of US hegemony in the Middle East and Latin America. So I think the choice of Southeast Asia and Philippines and Thailand is actually good, also to inform our colleagues and friends on the other side of the world that, hey, we exist. And I think little attention is paid to countries like Philippines and Thailand, despite their integral role in maintaining US stronghold in the region. As Santi mentioned, they are part of the Mutual Defense Treaty. These two countries, save from some historical moments, such as the base issue in 1991 with Subic, figure prominently in terms of international politics, only in these moments, and also terrorism and all that. But their problems are usually couched within domestic political analysis. So Mindanao is only a problem of the Philippines, Okinawa is only a problem of Japan, but really they're international. Human rights abuse specifically are barely linked to what's going on outside, and that by I mean international. To make these issues salient in the international domain, I think is one of the major contributions of Santino's book. Ultimately, Aid Imperium provides us with a framework that could help us rethink human rights from a broader perspective that integrates both international and local actors, and maybe to extend with Ice's comment, maybe later on grassroots actors. It is also an invitation to recast the binary thinking about aid, and this is another favorite point of mine, to de-essentialize aid, if you may, from the hardened liberal or post-colonial perspectives. As the book showed us, aid is neither good or bad, because its trajectory and outcome largely depends on the actors involved. Having said this, Aid Imperium also provokes us to think about the multitude of agencies involved in shaping foreign and domestic policies. How do their interests differ from the central government, and how does this affect their treatment of aid? A question I have in mind, though, is about the rise of China, particularly what happens when aid does not have strings attached? What would human rights be in cases where a donor, primarily interested in capital investment, and a recipient is plainly in need of development aid? So there's no normative component, so to speak. How about the impact of foreign aid from other big donors, such as the European Union? And here I kind of remember how President Duterte rejected EU's foreign package some time ago. And I hope another thing is that maybe I need a little more convincing that that we might be overstating the role of aid in these current regimes. For example, in the case of post-Cold War Ramos, it may be that it was East Asian countries' turn to development that drove the discourse. Because during this time, US was only interested in the development of East Asia, and any military interests are actually devoted to NATO and the conflict in Balkans, although Clinton was also reluctant to deal with that. Also, while GMA's instrumentalization of the war on terror comprised only one aspect of her foreign policy. And here I'm reminded of the debates in the US Congress where they're actually reluctant to support GMA's regime, and also that very, sensationalized decision of GMA to release a truck driver, which angered Washington very much. In any case, this question might be beyond the scope of the project and does not in any way diminish the book's potential impact to scholars, development and human rights policymakers and analysts, and the rest of its leaders. Ultimately, I feel that Aid Imperium, as an international relations person, is timely and necessary to broaden not only our scholarly understanding of human rights and foreign aid, but especially, I think, how intricately tied international and domestic politics are. And with that, I'd like to end. And yeah, congratulations, Santi, for your new book. Thanks.
Thanks, Mina.
Okay. Okay, back to me as the moderator.
Thank you.
So maybe I'll give a few few time for Santi to make his brief comments with the panelists.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mina. So I'll just speak for 3 minutes so that we'll have more time for discussion. So I got so much from these discussions. Actually, when I got the go-ahead a year ago from Michigan that the book will be published, I promised to myself that I will no longer write anything about aid. And in fact, I'm working on different projects. But I felt with this panel discussion, I'm being pushed to write more and learn more, in fact. And there's a lot more to learn from this aid, but something that we can only wish within our lifetime. So thanks so much for all the feedback. I learned a lot from the feedback, and this is something that I will take away later on as I do our weekend walks here in later on. So, but let me just react on 3 points. So the first is about path dependence, and I think Dahlia raised. I cannot react to all of the points here, but let me just highlight 3 points. So the issue of path dependence. I felt that towards the conclusion, I alluded to the idea that aid will always have these tentative effects in terms of promoting human rights or basically denigrating human rights to the extent that we live in a world order that is mired in inequality, material inequality, that I think I come from a very materialist point of view, that mediates all these socio-economic differentiations and hierarchies. So yeah, from time to time, you'll have aid that will promote physical integrity rights, that will promote economic development, but it is something that is tokenistic. I mean, Michael Barnett talks about the paternalism of humanitarianism because it will always be the strategic interest of those in power in donor and recipient states. So I think that and this is what I've been working on during this pandemic, really talking about the global politics of billionaires and super rich individuals. And I felt that we are always talking about inequalities, right? Or the democratic regression, but we're not talking about injustices that those on the top of the global socioeconomic hierarchy are agents of perpetrating those injustices. So I think that the design of aid, Imperium in itself, is really unsustainable. And that's why I think in the last few sentences of the book, I alluded to that. So unfortunately, that's the case, right? And I think it calls for us to rethink what kind of world order, what kind of utopia do we really want? And I think this is more of a philosophical question or a question for political theorists too. Second, China, no strings attached. What does it do? My starting point is that foreign aid does amplify what the existing interests are in recipient states. There's a book by Lina Ben Abdallah, Shaping the Future of Power, also published by Michigan 1 year ago. So last year, she talks about China and Africa relations. I think it's a wonderful book. It applies a Foucauldian analysis, but it also shows that in the case of China and Africa, there might not be blatant normative discourses, but it just amplifies the elites or the emerging elites in China. You have a lot of these African students and scholars who will go to China, and hopefully they'll come back and they'll amplify Chinese interests. This is nothing new. This is something that happened with Fulbright scholarships, with scholarships from Europe going back to their own respective countries. So I see here the interest of the amplification effect of Chinese interests. And the third point, I think this was mentioned also, what is the scope of agency? This is something that I felt I should have explicated further in the theorization, but I alluded to, so I used the term by Eric Grinovisky, who wrote an award-winning book about what he calls as FIBs, false intersubjective beliefs. So Eric Grinovisky from George Washington, and I use this term to the extent that you can still have cooperation even if some of your interests are diverging. And in the case of Duterte, sure, for example, in the public sphere, it was anti-China, but there's a lot of backroom negotiations that are beyond what we know here, right? So in fact, I hear some some anecdotal evidence that in fact these are contractors for the US military who in fact have more contracts than ever during the time of the last 5 years, right? Despite the fact that when you look into local media and international news outlets, you see that the US power in the Philippines or in South China Sea is receding, right? But you see on the ground that this is not the case. So there might be a case here of diverging interests in the public sphere, but really the strategic interests are played in actual policy-making table. I'll stop on that and I look forward to feedback and questions.
Okay, in the interest of saving time, maybe I'll go to the question that are raised. They're sent directly to me. So first question is from Professor Philip Binondo. So the ASEAN as a region has one of the lowest rates of human rights treaty accession and ratification. Asia also remains the only continent without a region-wide human rights mechanism institution. How significant has the US foreign aid been in the diffusion of international human rights norms and normalizing its universalism, especially in Asia, where the Asian values debate challenged the genuine universality of these norms?
Yeah, can I respond or shall we collect questions, me?
Actually, there's another question, but I think it's directed for ICE. Should I raise it too? Maybe we can all talk about it. Okay, this is from Riro Lopez. Hello, I would like to ask a question for Attorney Baguilat. In the earlier panels, there were a few discourse that dealt with decolonial perspectives. My question is, how does IP belief system relate to your understanding in the relation between aid and human rights? So I think everybody can address this too. Okay, so far only 2 questions. Okay, there's another one from Angelo Gutierrez. A great discussion. The aid Imperium concept resonates heavily in the field of digital information and communications development. Entire social technological ecosystems hinge on subscribing to an increasingly exclusionary US-led technological order, which the US is all too happy to promote through aid. In this heavily path-dependent system, where donors have strong power over the global system's direction, what options do recipient governments have to establish their own independent positions other than rejecting the aid? So far, that's it.
Yeah, thanks so much. Can I just answer the question about ASEAN? I know Kilian is an expert on ASEAN politics, but I wanted to say though that Emily Hafner Burton wrote fantastic scholarship on the role of treaties in human rights. And I felt that I'm very skeptical about treaties in general because treaties are signaling devices or signaling instruments, right? I mean, the work of Susan Hyde, published by Cornell a few years ago about pseudo-democrats' dilemma. Her puzzle was, why is it the case that even authoritarian leaders such as Putin and many others would invite international electoral observers only to find out that they know that they will manipulate the election. So this is the same dynamic with treaty accession. So I felt also that so how significant has US foreign aid been in the diffusion of international human rights? I think my stance here is quite similar to Sally Engel Mary, to the extent that the human rights vocabulary of the United States allowed us to actually empowered several individual civil society actors to basically push their own interests, right? So in the context of self-empowerment. So in other words, it becomes a self-empowering language. That is not to say that Global South communities don't have a human rights language. This is something that Boni Ibhawo, for example, and many others working on African human rights have been working on. Or Baka Mutua, for example, that in fact, a lot of Global South communities already have a linguistic apparatus for human rights, even before the French Revolution discourse of human rights. Even in Filipino, we have these terms of human rights, you know, from Karangan. There's a recent article in the Philippine Law Journal that examines the word human dignity, even before colonization. So I felt that it allows local actors to empower themselves. And I think the treaties, for example, starting from the International Bill of Rights, gives us a rallying point as a reference point for civil society actors to mobilize their interests. So in other words, I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'm pessimistic about treaties in general, or ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights. It's a good signaling device, but we should go beyond. We should go beyond that.
Thank you, Santi. Any comments regarding the question on IP, and then, of course, the question on aid Imperium's relationship with digital information age?
Yes,
I think Ice could respond first to the IP.
Okay, yes,
indigenous
go,
peoples. Yeah. First of all, allow me to say that I'm not speaking in behalf of the indigenous peoples communities in the Philippines, but I'm speaking as one. So in relation to that, I would like to say that the problem with issues regarding aid, particularly those directed to indigenous peoples communities, is that they always follow the idea of a protectorate relationship. And that the problem is that since it's mostly coming from people from the outside, they do not really look at the perspective of indigenous peoples groups. That's why we're trying to shift the way that we look at indigenous peoples as partners, rather than people who you are aiding because of your act of mercy. And that's something that's prevalent right now. So particularly in relation to environmental law, we're trying to see that there's a shift in the international aid, and indigenous peoples are now being looked at as stewards of the environment. Therefore, they are not anti-development, rather they are meant to ensure that sustainable development would always be protected. So regarding the belief systems, it's something that we are radically changing right now. And with climate change as a big issue, we are now at the forefront of that changing mentality. And I hope that it also comes with the idea of aid provided to indigenous people's community, because so long as people look at indigenous people's communities as just recipients of aid because we are at their mercy, we couldn't be on the same level. And any participation with OE under that protectorate role would not be embraced by the community. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Ice. And Santi, any comments?
Yeah, just a brief response to Angelo's question about digital technology. I think there are emerging research projects about this, on the role of the US in the global governance of digital technology. I think this is something that's very interesting, especially with the role of the internet in domestic politics. So I felt that this is something that we can look into. But I think it's a completely different literature than what I initially covered. So I encourage all of us perhaps to read more about how the US exerts its influence. I think there's also path dependence influence in the case of the US, considering that the internet was primarily a US invention. And I think with the global governance institutions, I think Jan Artskolte, the former colleague of Kilian, who's now in Leiden, from Gothenburg to Leiden, is working on these topics.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 1 minute or two maybe for any last comments from the panelists or Santi. Huh? Okay, maybe I'll do the last comments. Well, congratulations again, Santi, and I'm very happy with the turnout of the participants, and I hope the audience learned quite a lot from this discussion, and I encourage you, well, to ask your libraries to buy the book. Yeah, thank you and congratulations, Santi.
Thank you so much to everyone. Thanks, Mina and the panelists.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you, everybody.